Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event at End to promote this new book, From Soul to Soul, the Adidas sneakers of this gentleman here, Mr. Jacques Chassaing. Can we have a round of applause for
Good
Jacques?
evening.
If you're an
Thank you.
Adidas fan and you know much about the design history of Adidas, you should have been clapping pretty hard just now. And then we have Jason Coles, who worked on the book with Jacques. So we've spent the whole afternoon up at the Adidas office and feel kind of pretty talked out because we were speaking to a bunch of employees there about Jacques' history with Adidas. But we're going to give it another go tonight. My name's Gary Aspden. I've worked with Adidas in varying capacities for nearly 24 years, and I curate a range for Adidas called Adidas SPEZIAL, which has a huge debt of gratitude to this man here and this man's work, because of much of what this guy has done throughout his career is a reference point for the work that I do and has been a massive inspiration. So we're going to talk a little bit about footwear design, athletic footwear design. I've been looking through this book. I haven't finished reading it just yet, but I'm quite a way on with it because I've been busy putting together an exhibition in Manchester called the SPEZIAL FC exhibition, which is happening up in Circle Square. Jacques flew in yesterday. Jason travelled up from London and came and looked at the exhibition. And there was a lot of your work in there, Jacques. Talk to us a little bit about what do you think it is that makes lasting design in athletic footwear, trainers, sneakers, whatever you would like to call them?
I think the designing sport shoes or sport sneakers is probably for me it was the dream, a beginning of a dream. I started to work in the dress shoe industry, but for me it was something which had some limits, and I wanted always to focus on sports and always to join a company or big brand like Adidas. So I had the chance to do this in France. And afterwards, some years in France, I went to Germany to the global headquarters of Adidas and taking over some, I would say, a little bit more responsibility in footwear design from an international point of view. Just some words. I started Adidas in 1981. And as I said before, it was the dream. And it was my, I think, exploring all the sports, exploring what's going on in the sport, what's going on with athletes, and then producing for these guys a tool to achieve performance. This was my target, was my objective.
So nowadays, this whole world of athletic footwear, some people like to call it sneaker culture, has transformed really into something completely different. I always look upon the era when you were working as the kind of golden age of sportswear, because all those products you were making were all, you very much took on the ethics of Adi Dassler himself. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, yeah.
So, yeah. Do you want to expand on that for us a little bit about what that means for you? I mean, you took a lot of your lead from Adi Dassler, and you worked, when you were working for Adidas France, it was under Horst Dassler, which was Adi Dassler's eldest son. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about Adi Dassler's philosophy and how that influenced you and what you do? Because one of the things I've seen in the book is, you reference the Stan Smith, you reference the Gazelle, you reference the Country, and how these shoes were kind of an influence and an inspiration on your kind of creativity, design philosophy.
Yeah, sure. When I started with Adidas, the first thing I did, it was not designing the first day a new shoe. It was just going back a little bit to the history of the brand, understanding what Adidas did in the past, and basically understanding who was the guy who created the brand. That means Adi Dassler. And I did a kind of research. I was focusing on how this guy was working at that time, how this guy was speaking with athletes, how this guy was understanding the problems the athletes could face, and how the guy was working, finding solutions to problems. And this was for me a kind of guideline which I wanted always to respect. So that means that in that time, in the 80s, creating new shoes, we didn't think about sportswear, basically. We just thought about performance. We want to do a tennis shoe for a tennis player. We want to do a running shoe for a runner. We want to do a basketball shoe for a basketball player, just to improve the performance. Even shoes like Stan Smith, when a Stan Smith was created in the 60s, it was a shoe for playing tennis. It became an icon. It became an icon in sportswear. It was the same thing for a Superstar. Superstar was a shoe created for basketball. It was a performance shoe. It's sure that today you cannot play basketball with a Superstar, or you cannot play tennis with a Stan Smith. That's clear. But just to say that that time we were not thinking about, let's say, sports style or sportswear. We just thought about performance. And this was the target of a guy called Adi Dassler. No, he wanted just do the best for the athlete. And if shoes like Stan Smith or like a Superstar or even like a Forum became what we are today, that means you see these shoes more on the street. It's not because the designer did it that way. It was just something which was evolving in that situation you have today. And basically, who decided that? It's the consumer or the customer. But it was not the target of a designer at that time to say, I want to do now a tennis sportswear shoe.
So like because we were talking about this earlier, and when I was approached originally by the senior people in Adidas here in the UK, and they came to me and basically said, you know, if you wanted to reinstate Adidas's position in the top end of the market, if you will, stores like End here, what would you do? And I put forward this idea that became Adidas SPEZIAL, and I was saying to them, you know, I think we need a premium archive-inspired brand that's got a very strong Adidas brand identity. And then they turned around to me and said, okay, go ahead and do it. And I came out of the meeting and started scratching my head and thinking, what does that even mean? You know, what is a strong Adidas identity? And in order to establish that, I thought about my own identity, like how that was formed by where I was born, how I grew up, the experiences I had growing up, and how that's informed me as a person and as an adult. And I tried to take that idea and apply that to the brand. So even something like this graphic that's on this sweatshirt was inspired by an image of Adi Dassler holding a football boot where he's got the patch on his sweater. And I basically took that graphic and kind of subverted it, really, and put the three stripes and the reflection underneath, and it ended up looking like a modernist version of the trefoil. But the thing about it is, with what you do, Jacques, when we talk about shoes like Gazelle and Stan Smith and Superstar, then we look at your work in the 80s, it feels like such a natural progression from those shoes. And I think that stems from the philosophy that you adopted. But also what you do, to me, I'm totally in awe of it, because I'm just thinking about the aesthetics of these shoes and taking things that were performance-based technologies for their aesthetic values now in 2022. Whereas when you were making them, you were actually doing the thing that Adi Dassler talked about, which was speaking to the athletes. So do you want to tell us a couple of, so like, for example, I don't know how familiar the audience is with Adidas's back catalogue or the products that you worked on, but for example, you did the Lendl tennis shoes. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that design process and working with Ivan Lendl?
Yeah, I want to say that let's say doing a new tennis shoe at that time, the process started with looking at what Adidas did in tennis. The existing shoes, the existing tools, what were existing at that time in tennis. And now you make a kind of, you look at the sport itself and at the players, and you try to identify the problems a player can have at that time. And in tennis, the guys had some problems. The guys had also some problems because you have to consider speed, or you have to consider changing motions on the court. And all these things, it's a kind of research phase. And all these things, you get the data, and then you say, so I would like to do a new tennis shoe. And you have all these criteria. I call them a little bit like ingredients. You put this together, and based on this, it's your job to find solution to solve a problem the guys could face. And it's a slow process, starting with something. And we say always in design, you have the famous whys in design. Before you do something in design, you create something, you have to give answers to questions. And the questions are always starting with a W. Why do you want to do? What do you want to do? For whom you want to do it? And once you have the answer to this thing, then you can start scribbling on a paper, or even doing maybe a nice rendering or a nice drawing. And then you do to a second phase. From a 2D thing, you go to a 3D, you do a mock-up, which you can touch, and then you have a much more better idea about the shape of what you want to give to a product. So it's a process. It's based on a kind of always starting with a research. And it's not something which is coming in 5 minutes, You have to really to know what's going on. We speak about tennis, but it's the same for basketball. If I take the forum, how the forum came up. The forum came up in almost the same process. Looking at the sport, looking at basketball, what were the problems the guys had to face at that time? In basketball, it was ankle sprain. And then I was even looking at the guys sitting on the side of the court before going on the court to play. And before putting their shoes on, the guys were doing what we called a strapping. It's done directly on the skin of your foot. A strapping is to give you support, is to avoid this kind of problem of ankle sprain. The other thing what the guys were doing, they used an accessory they put under the heel, because in basketball, when you are jumping, landing, you can face this kind of problem, which is a heel bottoming, and this can give you much injuries. And you put all this problematic, all this ingredient to remember, and then you say, how can I do to improve, to avoid maybe the problems, or at least to decrease the problems? And the idea, having looked at the strapping on the skin, the idea came and say, why couldn't we do a shoe including all these things, which are separate components? You put all the components in one product. And that's the starting point of how the forum was done. And when you look at the forum, it has a cross. And the cross is not because maybe it's aesthetic to have a cross. The cross was done, I would say, from a geographical point of view, it's reflecting the major geometry of the strapping the guys were using at that time. So they were strapping their foot, and at the end, it looks like a cross. So this is mimicking a little bit this kind of cross strapping idea in the shoe. But the first prototype of the forum with the cross, today it's kind of cross stitch on the upper. But at that time, the cross was like a tunnel and channel. Inside the cross, you had a real strapping, flexible, stretchable strapping. But let's say from a production point of view, you couldn't do this at that time because all the engineering or all the opportunities doing products didn't allow to do this kind because of the complexity of the concept. So that's the reason why we ended up in forum with a kind of cross stitched onto the upper. And it's the same for the other sports. It's for Lendl, it's for running. When we started the ZX thing, it's the same thing. When I started with Adidas, I looked at all the so-called running shoes Adidas did. Or at that time, you had shoes which have been called running. Some other shoes, we call them jogging. That's a little bit thing which is a word you don't use today anymore. But and looking at this here, we thought about maybe all the runners are not the same. You have tall guys, you have small guys, you have big guys, you have people having problems. We have people who needed a shoe which was a more neutral shoe. They were just looking for some shock absorption, some cushioning. You have some other guys working, running, and had some pronation problems. Pronation means when you look from the back, when your shoes are doing like this here, collapsing to the medial side. Or we have guys, they are much more forefoot runner, and then they need a little bit more control in the forefoot. So based on this, and also on which surface you are running, and you could define a kind of different type of runners, different types of running consumers. And then you could put together a kind of organization in your collection, a kind of structure, and say, now I want to do a product for this kind of runners. I want to do a product for this kind of runners. And this was a little bit the starting point of ZX. The starting point of ZX was a little bit put something more in place, put a kind of order in all this thing, and not just doing new shoes. Okay, I do a new shoe today. I want to do a new shoes in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But it has to be, it was also a kind of respect for the consumer, respect for the runners. And when you had ZX starting, and ZX, people are asking why ZX, why Z and X, and a lot of people are thinking it's coming from some scientific research, but nothing to do with that. It was basically coming from marketing, and at that time you had a brand called Kawasaki. They came out with some bikes, and they called them ZX 500, 600, according to the power of the engine, and even according to the tires, you know, if the tires were much more for road or much more for trail or something like that. So we took just this over. And ZX it's important to have a right name for a collection. It's important to have a right name for a product. It has to be a little bit sexy, you know. Otherwise, otherwise it starts to be boring. And if a name is starting to be boring, the consumer, I would say, tends not to go there and not to look at it. But the thing starts here. And yeah, this was the starting point of the ZX. So we started with 500, and the 500 was a shoe which was for people needing a lot of stability. You know, when you are landing on the heel, you need to put your foot in the right direction to make the transition to the imports. And that's the reason why in the ZX 500 you have this heel counter, heel stabilizer. Once you are landing, it puts your foot in the right direction. And then we had shoes like 600 more for road, and 700 a little bit more for trail. So again, we're coming back to what the purpose was, not just doing a shoe for the sake of doing a new shoe. It was for the sake of a consumer, because we ended to say, we respect this guy, this type of runner, we respect this type of runner.
So on that topic, because, you know, with the ZX range, you did both men's and women's shoes as well. And I think, you know, they're probably my all-time favorite series of shoes. But also you were kind of unaware at the time that these things were crossing over with popular culture. So we'll talk about Run DMC in a minute, but let me ask you, Jason, we're talking about Jacques' process here of creating shoes. Do you want to talk to us about your process of creating this book with Jacques?
Sure, absolutely. It actually started with a previous book that I was researching, which I did actually all the way back in 2015, which was called Golden Kicks. And it was about famous sports shoes that athletes had won famous victories in, I guess. And when I went to the Adidas archive, every time I asked who did that shoe, Jacques Chassaing. Who did the Predator? Jacques Chassaing. Who did the Forum? Jacques Chassaing. So I was thinking, well, who the hell is this Jacques Chassaing guy? Cutting a long story short a bit, so eventually I was introduced to Jacques, and said to him, you know, do you fancy doing a bit, Jacques? Because I know you've got a lot of fans out there. And he just kind of looked at me and thought, you know, he just had a look on his face that said, why would anyone want to read the book on me? But I managed to convince him. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we did was just to spend time. I think I went to Strasbourg, which is Jacques' hometown. We spent about 2 days for what felt like 18 hours a day just talking about everything that he'd done, which was just mind-blowing, because I guess, you know, you kind of think that you know the history of some of these shoes, but when you're talking to the guy that actually created them, just these kind of knowledge bombs were just coming out that I knew that the fans were just going to love. And then we went over to Herzogenaurach, and we spent about 3 days in the Adidas archive, which again was just a real privilege to be able to sit with Jacques as he was able to hold, you know, these shoes in his own hand. Some of them he was kind of being reunited with, you know, after 20, 30 years. And again, just hearing his stories, stuff that in many cases had just never been heard before. Even the guys in the archive were, you know, kind of sitting there, jaws dropping, because they'd never heard some of this stuff. And it was literally a case of, spending all that time, getting all these stories and putting something together. But we never wanted it to just be a kind of encyclopedia of Jacques' shoes or a kind of a portfolio. It was really to give people a kind of insight, the inside story behind these shoes. Because we all, a lot of us have been wearing these shoes for years, but we don't actually know the stories behind them. And I mean, I found it, astounding that people didn't know that Stan Smith, Jacques didn't do the Stan Smith, but that people didn't know that Stan Smith was a tennis player. And so many of these shoes, the Forum, always been one of my favorites, and I thought I kind of knew everything about it. But things like, as Jacques explained, the story behind the cross piece. And I slowly started to realize that these shoes, they're all beautiful objects, but they're beautiful not because kind of Jacques was thinking about them aesthetically, but because he was thinking about performance features. So you look at any of these shoes that we're wearing, the reason they look good is not just because it was decoration. It comes from the fact that everything on these shoes has a particular performance feature. So when Jacques designed the Forum, as I discovered, he was really thinking about how he can make a basketball player play basketball better. And the more I realized that because of that kind of passion that he had for just making, performance enhancing shoes as such, that's why a lot of these shoes have become classics, not just because they look great, but because they were pieces of technology at that time.
Well, one thing I would say to what you just said there, though, you talked about the fans of Jacques. I kind of almost argue that there aren't that many fans of Jacques. They're fans of Jacques' products because nobody knew that Jacques was the guy behind all these products. There's certain other sportswear brands who like to elevate their designers into some kind. And this is the first time really that somebody has kind of told this story. And I mean, even like I consider myself pretty knowledgeable on Adidas, but as I'm reading through this book, I'm going, and he did that as well? And he did that as well? It's kind of like one or two hits is great, but it's kind of like, it's got a pretty good track record. And don't get me wrong, Jacques the first to put his hands up and say, not everything I did was successful.
I have to say something,
Cool.
Just speaking some words about the book. And as Jason mentioned, it's not a catalog of products. If you want to say it's a catalog, but I would say it's a catalog of experiences. And it's a catalog of experience connected to a period of time. And in these experiences, you might have one product, you might have 2 or 3 products. And but what I wanted to have, I didn't want to have a book with Jacques Chassaing did this and that. That doesn't interest me because I think I had always a team with me. I had always people working with me. And it's not about just me. It's about a complete team work and with people having different responsibilities. And the whole thing made what's happening today, And it's not one guy. I'm just representing these people. I'm trying to represent what the work they did, the job they achieved. That's about the book, And I hope we achieve this objective,
So talk to us about Run DMC. So, you were designing shoes for athletes, for tennis players, and for runners, and then one day you get the call about there's these rappers who are making music and wearing Adidas products, and could you design a range for these guys? Because I was saying today, for me, talking to you today is like a full circle moment for me. I saw Run DMC at Manchester Apollo in 1987 before you could buy superstars in the UK, and I remember the first place I saw the Run DMC range, they were parallel imported by a shop called Geese in Manchester, and I bought a pair of Ultra Stars from there because it's the first time I'd seen a shell toe, if you will, in the flesh. So, but you were actually there and you designed their range. That whole story was so kind of ahead of its time, essentially. You know, paying rappers $1 million to do signature shoes and signature apparel for them. Nobody had dreamt of doing that in the sportswear industry at that time. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, working on Run DMC, I think we did this with our colleagues of America, of the USA, because the guys were in direct contact with the Run DMC guys. And the Run DMC period was the starting point of, like hip hop coming into sports, or sports joining the hip hop scene. And designing this kind of product, we were not designing a product for a basketball player. We were designing products. Now it was new also for us to design product for entertainers and the music thing and everything. So it was a little bit different story. The purpose here was not to do the best basketball shoe. The purpose was not to do the best performance shoe, but the purpose was to do a shoe which is a little bit reflecting the attitude of these guys. And even when you go back to performance, in each performance shoe, the way the shoe is constructed, somewhere it's reflecting the attitude or the character of a player. And it's the same thing, when you, Adidas or Nike, when doing a shoe for Lendl was not the same thing when doing a shoe for Stefan Edberg, because they are two different players. For Nike, it was the same. Doing a shoe for Nadal or doing a shoe for Sampras, it was totally different. And you could see this in the product. You had on one side, you had the shoe which was a little bit more crazy oriented. On the other side, you had the shoe which was a little bit more quiet. So it's the same thing. And here, we were not working to do something for athletes, regular athletes, but here we were doing something for music. And we had to understand their attitude and try to reflect it in the product. And basically, the Run DMC shoes were not totally new shoes. They were just shoes, keeping the components, existing components from a forum, existing component from a superstar, what we did with Ultra Shell or all these shoes, but just adding a little bit some features which made it a little bit more fun, more entertainment. And when you had this kind of almost a superstar with a fat laces or with a gusset style of gusset tongue, where you didn't have to lace the shoe, but just slip in and slip out. And this was, I would say, nothing to do to improve your performance, but it was just reflecting something which was going on in a totally different area. And that's the thing that Adidas at that time, it was new for Adidas. And it was not Adidas who went to Run DMC. It was the reverse thing. It was the Run DMC guys who choose and having the superstar in the hand, and that's the starting thing. Because Adidas was used to do shoes for players in basketball for Abdul Jabbar at that time. And then later for Pat Ewing, and later for some other guys in tennis, Edberg, Lendl, Steffi Graf, and all those things. So it was a totally new opening, I would say, a new era starting.
Yeah, because there's this marriage of culture and sportswear that is kind of is standardized now. It's the way the sportswear industry is. But back then, I mean, I was saying earlier about when I met Stan Smith, and I was talking to Stan Smith and said, when you were wearing your shoes in the 70s, did you realize that David Bowie was wearing your shoes and that John Lennon was wearing your shoes? He had absolutely no idea. He was too busy kind of going to Roland Garros or Wimbledon or whatever. He had no idea about that stuff. And so the Run DMC, in a way, is the first time the two things really collide, I think, in a very overt way, and the two things are kind of crystallized. Because when I was reading the book and it was talking about your design of the Ultrastar, and you put the elastics inside them so they could be worn without laces like they wore them on stage. There's slightly different considerations to the considerations of somebody on court, but it's the same kind of ideology. You're looking for solutions.
Yeah, it's just when you always speak about performance. When you have to do with an athlete, you speak about real performance on the court or on the pitch. And here it's also performance, but you are speaking with different people, So, but I would always call them performance, because performance is something you can improve a product, not just from a functional point of view, but you can improve a product from an appealing point of view. And that's a little bit this what was going on Run DMC. Here it was not playing better basketball or playing better another sport. It was more about increasing or improving the appealing.
So you worked on the Lendl shoes, you worked on the rivalries, you worked on the forums, you worked on the ZX series, the first ZX series, the Torsion, the second ZX series. Then you were
just one thing. I didn't do everything, you know.
but you did work, you did have some involvement.
Otherwise, I would have been CEO of Adidas, and yeah. So, so slow down a little bit, and yeah, okay. I think
they are in your book.
Yeah, the thing is that the job of a designer is designing shoes is one thing, but if you want to do a good design, you need some guidelines. And the role of a function of a design manager is really important. If you want to get some good stuff coming out of a designer, you need to guide this guy. And it's not just telling the guy, do me a new tennis shoe, but you should give him some guidelines. And that's also, it was my job too, because as I mentioned it before, I had a team of designers. And the thing is it was a kind of working together, you know, trying to guide the guy in the right direction or explaining some stuff about the sport and trying to find solution together. This was also a thing. Yeah, that's what I just wanted to add.
He really is overly modest, but anyway, I'm going to keep telling you how great you are. So Predator, you went, 1990s, Adidas changes its brand mark from my beloved trefoil to the performance logo. Peter Moore and Rob Strasser were driving that. You became very friendly with Peter Moore, and talk to us about the first equipment range and then going on to work on the Predator boots, the first Predator boots.
Yeah, late 80s, beginning of 90s, we had two guys coming to Adidas. One was Rob Strasser, who was a former marketing guru and the right hand of Phil Knight, and Peter Moore, who was the creative director at Nike. So we left Nike in 87, and we created our own agency at that time, which was called Sports Inc., and we presented a concept for different brands. So I went to Adidas with a concept called Equipment. And Equipment was basically something coming from Peter Moore, who, when he came to Herzogenaurach in the German headquarters of Adidas, when he went to the archives, and when he looked at the shoes, he called, first of all, a guy, Adidas, he called him the equipment manager, because he thought he was the guy giving the right equipment to the athlete. And this was what Peter said. He said, we have to go back to his thing, you know. And for an athlete, just do what you need to performance. And this was the starting point of Equipment. And Equipment was not overloading products to make them more expensive. Equipment was to do the essentials. And when we started in 91 with the first collection, we started with running shoes, running support, neutral, and cushion and guidance. And when we added some other shoes, racing shoes, we added basketball, we added tennis, and some other categories. And these were a little bit the flagship of the Adidas brand Equipment. And still, you can find some shoes today because they're becoming some sports style things.
And the Predator, you worked with Craig Johnson on because let's face it, that boot was an absolute game changer.
Yeah, Craig Johnson was a great guy. You know, you had to know this guy. You know, and this was also a kind of milestone in my career, knowing people. And Greg was one of the guy. He was just a guy with a kind of crazy passion for what he was doing, having new ideas. And he came to Adidas with his bags full of, I thought at the beginning they were rubber garden boots, you know. So they were football boots, but completely in rubber. And it had this kind of fins on the top, you know, this kind of special things. And he said, this will influence the direction of the ball when you kick. So how can we prove this? You know, it's nice to say you have a great idea, but then you have to prove it. So we went to Bayern Munich in the training camp in Bayern Munich. And we had at that time guys like Breitner, like Rummenigge, like Beckenbauer. And it was, I remember a day, it was a winter and it was snowing. And so we went outside and the guys started to kick the ball. And after the session, a guy like Breitner came and said, hey, I don't know, but something is going on with that shoe. And they couldn't tell what, but we had the feeling that something was different from regular football boots. And from a creative side or from a designer side, when you hear this, when you have a new idea, when you try, and when people are, the first comment is like this here, it's pretty positive, you know. And this is something which is, I would say, push your motivation to follow up the project, to follow up the idea. This was a starting point of what is still today called Predator. The design change of the boots, you know, from one season to the other season, but it's clear. The functionality, we already always started to try to improve the function of the product. So you had some different designs, you had some different aesthetics, but the basic concept still is here.
So when you were putting the book together, Jason, what, like, because there's, like Jacques saying, this is a kind of a catalogue of experiences more than a catalogue of products, but you're using product to tell those experiences. How did you kind of select which stories to tell? Because there's so many, I'm guessing, and you've got to kind of find a way for this to flow together. I'm guessing it was collaborative, or do you want to tell us?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as you said, Gary, the Jacques' greatest hits, you know, we could have done 3 books, to be honest, with all the shoes that Jacques has done. But
Jacques and his team.
Jacques and his team. But yeah, it was really just a case of saying to Jacques, you know, which are your kind of favorite children in many ways, which are the ones that mean, you know, that much more to you, and which I think was a hard choice for you, wasn't it? I mean, how do you choose your favorite children? But I guess there are various milestones in your career which we try to reflect. So yeah, starting with the ZX 500 and going right up to, well, the ZX 10,000 wasn't it? I suppose the last shoe in the book, and choosing shoes which in a way would be able to allow Jacques to kind of share his life experiences at Adidas. And I guess there are as many kind of lowlights as well as there are highlights, because as Jacques is always quite keen to point out, you know, you learn as much from your failures as you do from your successes. And Jacques is always the first person to say that there are some shoes that he's probably a little bit less proud of. He called them shit. I didn't call them that. But there are others that were obviously, you know, massive hits and which we're still wearing today. But there are shoes that we still remember, like, I guess, like the Tubular, which was not exactly very successful at the time, but then went on to have a big influence on later shoes. So it was just, yeah, it was a case of trying to just find those shoes that really told the most interesting stories.
And did you want to put the misses in there alongside some of the hits to sort of try and balance the story?
Yeah, and because as I say, you know, Jacques was keen to point out to people that you do learn from your failures. I don't like to mention Michael Jordan in this, but he's always keen to point out that, you know, he failed or he succeeded because he failed. And that's very much the case with Jacques, I think. So one thing that we were really keen to do was make this a book that wasn't just for sneakerheads as such, but for creators, for designers. And part of that process, as I've found, as any creative person has found, is that you probably do learn more from the things that don't go quite right, probably more so than the things that are a success. So yeah, it was really a case of trying to find some of those stories and some of those shoes that reflected your life, I guess.
I think if I would have to make a choice, I would say the story is combined to the forum thing, you know. So it's a little bit much more explained in the book, but in the process of designing or creating a forum, I had to go at the beginning of a project to go to the States. And we had a meeting with distributors of Adidas at that time in the States. And on my way back, I stopped in New York and to meet with a basketball coach, which was at that time, the same time, he was a rep of Adidas. And landing in New York Kennedy Airport, it was the beginning of a snowstorm. So I was blocked in the airport. I spent one night there and had some few words with the coach, but he had to go back at home because of a snowstorm. So I spent this night in the airport, and I saw people fighting because some flight companies gave coupons to get food, and so ours didn't give. So people were starting to fight. And the other day, they took us to the Fifth Avenue to an hotel, and that's the first time in my life I saw people doing cross-country skiing on the Fifth Avenue. You know, so this is something. Maybe it's a little bit childish, but it's kind of memories which afterwards you connect to something. And this is for me always connected to the time when the forum was in progress. And this is, for me, it's almost all products you can find, you have a story behind. And this is also something which I believe in, because it's doing a new product. It's not just saying, you know, I use this system here, it gives you more cushioning or gives you more, that's fine. But you need to create a kind of emotional connection between the product and between maybe the people who are interested in the product. And these are things which create this emotion. And yeah, we can say for ZX or some other stuff, they're always kind of, at least it's my case, always kind of connection with a story. And this is also what we say today, it's a storytelling thing, you know.
So what are your thoughts on Adidas Originals? So, you know, when Peter Moore joins the company, he changes the logo from the trefoil to the badge of sport. They do a very early incarnation of Originals. 9 years later, that becomes a division of the company. But some of the shoes that you designed that might not have been that successful commercially when they were first released get this kind of second wind. So, for example, nobody really expected the Continental to take off in the way that it did a few years ago. How do you feel now when you see these things that you were designing? I mean, because as you know, we know when you talk about the people above you giving you directives, the Continental was originally quite a commercially driven decision when you were given the brief to do that shoe. How do you feel about Adidas Originals and this idea of honouring the history of Adidas by reissuing products? What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is also something which was based on a request from the consumers, you know. And people at that time are always still wearing Stan Smith, and today still wearing Stan Smith. So it's basically the consumer who is deciding which kind of product. And when looking back, you have some shoes which became icons. And or if you take a Superstar, it's the same thing, or Pro Model, or some other shoes. Originals, I would say, started with Peter Moore and Rob Strasser. We had meetings and we said, okay, we have this kind of iconic shoes, Stan Smith and Pro Model, Marathon Trainer, Superstar. And we said, you know, because this was early 90s, and we said probably the consumer was maybe still wearing or wanted to wear with Stan Smith, but maybe we can improve the product, because the use of the product was a different use, because you needed more comfort wearing it on the street. So we took these shoes and we started to improve, let's say, the tongue, you know, the tongue of the shoes. We added more padding just to make it more comfort. We changed the material of the lining. Instead of having a kind of smooth PVC lining or plastic lining, we ended up to a kind of more comfort lining, you know, more frotté lining like that. So we improved all the products with some features, giving a kind of more second level of comfort to the product. And this was a little bit the starting point of Originals, and it became later a division, you know, with all the products still you can see today, you know.
Because it's a very different proposition making shoes for their lifestyle, leisure, aesthetic value than making performance shoes. but coming kind of bringing it up to, you were talking about the ZX 10,000, and there's two guys in here who are hiding somewhere at the back who you had dinner with, who you worked on these shoes with. Because when you talk about the team, I know there's George and Charles are hiding back there who work with me on SPEZIAL as well. But this ZX 10,000, you consulted on this shoe, and as I told you earlier, when I first saw this shoe, I felt incredibly jealous because it was, yeah, I mean, I think it was just such a great piece of design. It was that you came up with the team. Talk to us about that.
So we went together and we said, what can we do with we need to do a new ZX. And what we did is that instead of doing a ZX based on the materials or technology of 2019, we said, no, let's go back in 1989 when the first ZX range was launched, and at that time, the last shoe was called the ZX 9000. And we say, okay, now we're in 1989. Let's say we have to do a new shoe. We have to increase the range, and let's do a ZX 10,000. And then the second question, how can we do this? What are we doing? So going always back in these years, we use materials, we use process of engineering, processes of construction of a shoe, what was used at that time, and not what used in 2019. And that's the result here, because the result of this shoe, which was done basically launched in 2019, you would have expected a shoe with some molded things and a lot of applications on it, what's going on today, you know. No, we just came back to the original craftsmanship of a ZX. And yeah, so it ended up to a shoe, I think, which was not bad and had a good success. And also, maybe I'm still speaking too much about team, but having these four guys together, and it was really a kind of also a respect of responsibility of each of us, and that's the reason why you can get a success. If the team is working in the right way together, you can only succeed.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jason. Has anybody here got any comments or questions you'd like to ask these guys? Don't be shy. I know this is where everybody starts looking at the ground and feeling a bit uncomfortable, but does anybody want to ask any questions? You've got.
It's a real honour and a pleasure to listen to you speak about the way you design trainers. For people like myself who are long-time collectors, it's unbelievable. But what I would like you to talk about, if you could, in a little bit more detail, is the work that you did with Peter Moore. I know, he's just recently died, and he was just, for a lot of us, it was a massive move for him, going from Nike to Adidas. But could you just tell us a little bit more detail, kind of how you worked together, please?
When I met first time Rob Strasser and Peter Moore, I think it was a new era starting for me, And it was the first time I could speak and discuss with people like these two guys, and even a guy like Peter Moore was, I would say, the most creative guy I never met, And it was the same thing when he was at Nike, He was a guy designing the Jordan 1, and he was the guy designing the logo, the Jumpman, and he was really the creative thing. And also, he also had some kind of logic in his speaking, in his thinking and about sport, about sneakers, and everything had a logical thing, in everything, doing logos or doing products, and I think it became, for me, he was my mentor, and we still had contact until his death. It was almost every week we exchanged it, and I always saying, in the world of introvert guys, I think you had two specialists here, a guy like Peter Moore and myself, We were not so expansive in communicating, but I would say what we were saying or what we were discussing, for us, it made always sense. For our guys, I don't know. But for us, yeah, it was just a thing. And I have to say, I learned a lot from him. And and even a guy like Rob Strasser, it was exactly the same thing. Rob Strasser was he was called at Nike a marketing guru, And this is why, because this guy had a vision. It's not just speaking for speaking. It was the guy had a vision, and I remember when he was coming in the morning in the office, he went to my office, and he liked always my office because I had a kind of mess, a chaos going on in my office with shoes, with prototypes, and he liked that. And he said, "Oh, Jacques, what are we doing today?" And we spoke about 2-3 words, and then we said, "Okay, let's do this kind of stuff. Let's do this kind of thing." So that means it was a guy, visionary guy, and you had a guy, a great creative guy, Peter Moore. But it's I would say, if you want to speak about my career, I think these are the milestone of my thinking. And I'm pretty proud to have met these guys.
Can I just add, because one thing a lot of people don't know is that Peter Moore actually art directed the book. And just that was kind of one of the, the real privileges of my life, just to work with someone like Peter and to learn from him on that whole process. And I'm probably getting a bit emotional here, but sadly Peter died just 2 weeks after we put the book to bed. And so this is, the very final piece of work from Peter. So we very much dedicate this to the memory of Peter.
I want to say thank you very much to both of you for coming along. Thanks everybody for coming and listening. I hope you found it as interesting and inspiring as I have. Like I said, this man's work has been a huge, huge influence on my work, and hopefully more generations of Adidas fans to come. So give him a big hand. Thanks very much.